Hello, good afternoon. What, I wonder, has the man organising next month's Miss World, Eric Morley, royal dress designer Bruce Oldfield, and author Leslie Thomas got in common? Answer: when they started out, no one would have given much for their chances of success. They were all brought up in children's homes, and despite this, or even because of it, went on to the top of their professions. So, at a time when cruelty to children by their parents is so much in the news, A+4 Today focuses on what it's like to grow up in a children's home. Dilly Braimoh, now a journalist, left a children's home in Surrey called Beechholme 15 years ago. We asked him to go back and record his feelings and to track down some of his contemporaries.
Well, this is it. Or at least, this was it. This was the site of Beechholme, the children's home that I grew up in. It's not here anymore because back in April 1976, the whole site was bought by developers, knocked down and replaced by this private housing estate. It feels rather strange coming back here because, as with many of the children, I was much too young to remember my parents. In fact, I was only 2 years old. So Beechholme wasn't just the only home that I ever knew. The only family that I'd ever known lived here as well. And now, it no longer exists. But what a place it was. Built in 1880, Beechholme, with its 50 separate buildings in over 40 acres, originally housed those children from the boroughs of Kensington and Chelsea who had been orphaned, deserted, or whose parents simply couldn't cope. It was built in the Bansard area, just a stone's throw from the Epsom racecourse, mainly because it was thought that the rural atmosphere and the fresh country air would benefit those kids who were more used to living in the smoggy, crowded and decidedly unhealthy slums of London. In those early days, Beechholme housed about 720 children, but when I was there, the number had fallen to around 400 kids of every colour and creed you can think of, including children that were mentally or physically handicapped. I must admit that I really enjoyed the place, although not having parents or a home to make comparisons with, it was a bit easier. And being such a sweet little creep anyway, I was rather liked. As with all the other kids, I never really wanted for anything. You were fed, clothed, had a comfortable bed, and even given pocket money. So I suppose it couldn't have been that bad. I imagine that I have the same sort of memories as those ordinary children with conventional homes and families, of going swimming, riding bikes, and wandering up to the top field to play football with the lads, or like any ordinary kid from a proper home, lean over the fence and throw stones at the passing double-decker buses. I made a lot of good friends while I was at Beechholme, and even though I left 15 years ago, there are some of us that are still in touch. And like myself, there are those that want to tell people about Beechholme, what it was like, and the effects that it's had on the children that were once there. I've tracked down 3 of my Beechholme friends to help me, one of which is Frank. He left Beechholme before me, but when I did leave, we both shared a bedsit in southwest London. Now, Frank was nobody's fool, and at the time was probably a lot more streetwise than I was. And even though he then looked as though he couldn't punch his way out of a paper bag, he was a survivor. So that when he moved away from the Wimbledon area and up into London, living in hostels and with the occasional sympathetic friend, he had enough wits to cope. But he admits his real saving was meeting his wife, Sandra, because she was more level-headed, and it was her stability that steered him away from the influence of drugs. They've been together for almost 15 years now, and they're very proud of their 4 children, none of whom, Frank is determined, will ever see the inside of a children's home or suffer the deprivation that he had to. To ensure this, Frank stays at home minding the family, while Sandra is the breadwinner. This planned role reversal is to give him time and opportunity for his other great love, karate, a sport that he can put everything into. It controls and channels all that aggression because, not surprisingly, there's still a lot of anger left from the old days. The idea at the moment is to carry on training for another year or so and then open up his own club or teach in another one. And he probably will. He's got the determination and he'll do it. Someone who's always been able to look after herself is Yvonne. She was a big girl even in the Beechholme days, and she'd soon tell you where to get off. I reckon this was partly a self-protective measure because she hated it there, which was almost entirely due to her house parents. From the time that she and her 4 brothers and sisters were put in her particular house, they were constantly told how lucky and indebted to the taxpayer they were. When it came to the time for her to leave Beechholme, she felt like it was the end of a prison sentence. As with most of us when she left, she was put in a bedsit and left to cope, with just the occasional visit from her social worker. Having never been taught how to deal with money or bills or cooking and cleaning, plus having no friends in the area, she found life really difficult. Her first 2 to 3 years were the hardest, but like all of us realised, you just had to muddle through, or you were sunk. She eventually met her husband, Marty. They've now been married for 14 years with their 11-year-old daughter, Joanna. One indication of how children who have been in care stabilise when they go into the outside world is how long they stay in employment. Well, Yvonne feels that she's done better than many of her Beechholme contemporaries, having been a telephonist receptionist with a major car distributor for the last 10 years. But don't be misled into thinking that the natural course of time is going to help break down those barriers of mistrust and insecurity and make everything all right. No, it doesn't always work like that. In fact, those of us that have achieved some measure of security count it as quite an achievement. There are those that, despite the years that have passed since they left Beechholme, are still having a hard time. Thomas came to Beechholme from a convent home in Bexhill. Compared to the convent, Beechholme was a paradise where everything you needed was provided. And of course, it was also less strict than the convent. Thomas had a happier time at Beechholme than some of the other kids because he had good house parents that gave him a lot of attention and affection, and in general was spoilt rotten. It was possible for some of us to start work while we were still at Beechholme, and that's exactly what Thomas did, although obviously at some stage it was time to leave. It's a memory that Thomas would rather not have, and the first place that he did find after leaving Beechholme was a squat. He found it difficult to make friends, not to mention managing the seemingly simple things like laundry, cooking or money. Don't forget, all of these things were done for us in Beechholme. So, after numerous jobs and living in different flats and bedsits and staying in the general area that Beechholme used to be, how does he reckon he's got on in the 11 years or so that he's left Beechholme? Well, in his early to middle 20s, to say that Thomas liked a good drink was an understatement. And there was always the tales of the havoc he'd caused after a good session. In fact, more than once I had to step in and break up a fight between Thomas and somebody else. Being brought up in an institution like Beechholme, for that's what it was, an institution, affected all of us that grew up there. I was lucky, I coped, for perhaps by telling people about Beechholme will help them to understand how being a child in care has affected the rest of our lives.
Well, with me in the studio are Yvonne, Thomas, Frank, and of course Dilly. Dilly, you were very keen on making the film. Why did you particularly want to do it?
I felt that children that have been in kids' homes have been on the wrong foot from the moment they start. They've got the stigma of guilt with them. They're in a children's home through no fault of their own, and yet they feel guilty. They feel as though people are saying it's their fault. Children at school, the house parents, people outside are saying, what are you in there for? What have you done? Why are you here? And of course, now I feel that it's time to say, don't feel embarrassed, don't feel guilty, it's not your fault,